peace may soon descend upon the so-called China-US trade war. Chinese and US trade representatives are back in Washington, striving to hammer out a deal to end more than 9 months of trade tensions. US President Donald Trump is expected to meet Chinese Vice Premier Liu He Thursday. How close are they to a comprehensive deal? And what's been the give and take? How would continued trade tensions between these two economic powers affect the rest of the world? Joining me for the discussion are in Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics, and from the US, Professor James Ray of California State University in Sacramento. Welcome to the show, professors. So what do you make of these media reports claiming that a 2025 deadline for the Chinese side will be set to fulfill certain pledges like buying more US commodities and allowing 100% ownership of US firms in China, or China might face tariffs? I mean, how accurate do you think these reports are, James?
Well, I think China long ago accepted that joint ventures weren't the only pathway for foreign companies to invest, so I don't think that's a very hard lift to get that accepted. And I think, of course, if China's going to go up to $1 trillion of purchasing American products, that will take some years, so I think 2025 is a reasonable goal. So I think those are areas of cooperation and compromise that certainly are the foundation of the talks. There'll be some other issues that I'm sure you'll bring up that could still be sticking points.
Professor Liu, do you think that we are really close to a deal, given that there's that big, problem of enforcement?
Well, I think China considers the bilateral relationship as the most important one when China is really chartering its own roadmap towards further globalization. And now actually it serves China's interest in many ways. One is that, okay, China does need those soybeans, natural gas, etc., to fuel up its further growth momentum. And also for the protection of intellectual property rights. So these are really something that is taken for granted, that China is really stepping up the efforts. And as how to deliver the structural reform, I do not think even Chinese policymakers are really having a very clear map so far. So and then how to ensure that all those promises are really delivered and enforced. So those are really the very important question. So and then the still uncertainty is hovering around whether those politicians would change their mind. So along the way, so these are really the something that the business community and also many other observers are really apprehensive about.
James, you mentioned sticking points. I mean, obviously the US had wanted China to reduce state subsidies, but that was a deal breaker for China. And then there's the issue of protection of intellectual property rights, which China has made progress on. Do you think that's enough to satisfy the US?
No, I don't. I think this, we've kind of discovered, was not simply a tactical move of the Trump administration, but really a broader strategic plan, I think, to confront the growth of China. And its economic model was brought up in the very first round of negotiations as problematic, and certainly that's an untenable position. But I think as these small pieces get settled, I still think the advisors, Robert Lighthizer, the Commerce Secretary, and Peter Navarro, are very hostile to China, and I don't think they're going to be comfortable with any kind of commitment, even if there are benchmarks. I think they might continue to move the goalposts, because even a year ago, China agreed to most of these concessions to buy more American goods and enter into greater respect for intellectual property rights and make the beginning of some of these structural reforms. And so, again, the question is on the timing. If the U.S. and the Trump administration, thinking ahead to the election, wants a deal closer to the election where they can take greater credit for a victory, or if they want to start to reduce the trade deficit with a sooner deal. But I think this is going to remain unsettled, and because the Trump administration doesn't like the WTO protocols, it's going to be back and forth, obviously for foreseeable future.
Professor Liu, do you agree that it's possible that we won't see a deal because of these hardline requests?
Well, we cannot really rule out the possibility because one is that Trump is typically unpredictable. The other is that in some way he's really losing control to a certain extent because there are a number of interest groups that are pushing the envelope when he really wanted to have an early harvest deal, at least to claim temporary victory. And the other issue is that, okay, the assumption over China. He thought, well, you know, I pushed open, you know, the doors on the China side. Why don't I get more? But China has its own bottom line. So, and then how really those can really be enforced, and how the, you know, how the U.S. side can really concede on this one. It seems that the U.S. is really playing a upper hand, but in the meantime, China has its own agenda to require what can be delivered to compromise from the U.S. side. So China comes slow, but you know, they come in a sure and a strategic way. So those are really the uncertainties that are still you know, looming ahead.
James, is that so that Trump has kind of delegated this to the negotiators? I mean, certainly his tweets have subsided on the China trade issue.
Well, you know, there are advocates for a deal. I think certainly the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, would be in favor, and I think Trump is unpredictable, and he may be persuaded by those that say this is the best deal that can be had, and this will lower the trade deficit and will look good politically. But I think his desire to bring back manufacturing to the U.S., and you know, as we know, this is not limited to China. His battle with Canada and Mexico to restructure the NAFTA free trade agreement, his ongoing frustrations with Europeans and others. You know, this is not a purely U.S.-China issue, but it's Trump's disdain for multilateralism and the architecture of free trade globally. And so I think he will continue to resolve things bilaterally, and then will likely use this threat of tariffs as a way of leveraging American power in these deals. But I think, you know, for China is going to want to have a final resolution that leads to a summit with President Xi and President Trump where they can finalize this deal. And I think President Trump meeting with the top negotiator, Liu He, is a sign of seriousness, and hopefully that will lead to some progress in the next, you know, 48 hours.
To what degree, Professor Liu, is the U.S. economy and how it's faring lately affecting these trade talks? And also, you know, what lobbyists, that is the U.S. corporations and their earnings, how is that affecting the trade talks?
Well, people normally estimate that the tariff will be dispersed normally in a matter of 3 to 8 months, because you know, you charge tariff on those importers, and importers will shift those costs onto the distributor, onto the retailer, etc. So eventually consumers will feel the burden. So right now, you know, when the trade spats has been there almost for a year, so consumers already feel uncomfortable of this. So the other is that many of those retailers, distributors who really rely on the China trade, because China exports is so far the largest, particularly in the consumer electronics, in garments, etc. So they feel the pinch. And now the businesses, investors, they had a mixed feeling. They hope that the Trump administration can push further open Chinese store and provide a better investment climate for them. But now they are beginning to lose patience, because you know, where is the end game? So because they need to make a decision with a timeline. Now the timeline is not really very certain. So he is now being pushed to at least to have a early harvest type of game, and he can really deliver to those people.
So James, if we get a deal or if the tensions linger, what might be the short-term impact on the markets, on global growth and corporate earnings?
Well, you know, they've followed fairly closely. The markets have gone up recently with some optimism, and you know, the margins are fairly small in the movement of markets, but they're certainly impacted by the relationship. As long as there's a dialogue, I think that provides stability. If you know, we saw something like we saw in the Vietnam summit where President Trump were to walk out of the expected discussions and take a harder line, then that would rattle markets, and I think that's certainly not something the U.S. is likely to do. So I think whether it's a deal, which would boost confidence globally and growth and in the markets, or if it's just the ongoing discussions, I think that maintains stability.
So given Trump's predilection for bilateral deals, how is this going to impact longer-term considerations like global value chains? For example, we're hearing that there is this growing trend of nearshoring, that is, companies not setting up operations, you know, far away, but actually setting up near the markets. Professor Liu?
I think it's a wake-up call to many of those stakeholders. In the first place, China will have to reconsider the level of interdependence between the two biggest economies, and that is why you see the President Xi has been visiting Europe, and we really try to, you know, diversify our market by dispersing the possible risk, given the unpredictability going on at in the other end of the Pacific. And also businesses are also really watching over what can really lie ahead, and in terms of risk management, though they have to adjust their the supply chain, so that diversity is really the key word. And then in the financial market, China is really opening very fast. So I think that the financial sector is going to have a better assurance, but in the manufacturing sector, there's going to be quite a momentum for readjustment to reduce the dependence on the U.S. market from the China side, but also from multinationals.
And James, do you see that on the U.S. side, where companies are reconsidering their whole manufacture in China for export model?
Well, I do think there is some ambition in the Trump administration to, though there's been conflict with Mexico, to bring a lot of the manufacturing closer to American shores and partially to reinvent American manufacturing. America's really, I'd say, to disadvantage, though, as a consumer economy that is going to have trade deficits with most of its trade partners. Innovation is what drives American economy, and I think that's where the aspect of intellectual property arises, and the concern over Huawei and 5G technology. Because in manufacturing, China's just much better positioned close to a larger pool of natural resources in Central Asia. The Belt and Road and the Silk Road Initiative really put China as the engine of growth in manufacturing and then moving into high tech. And because many of the world's countries joined the AIIB, and because the United States has sort of walked back from the WTO, it's created this vacuum in global leadership. And you know, as we know, China's really stepping into that space, and a lot of American allies are skeptical of America's current orientation. So I think there's a lot of headwinds for the United States in maintaining this protectionist orientation, because really the U.S. needs kind of a global architecture like the WTO to ensure a fair playing field and encourage countries like China to continue the reforms of opening that have led to so much of this trade.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap things up here. Thank you so much to both professors, Mr. Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, and Professor James Ray from California State University, joining us from Sacramento. Thank you.